This is an excerpt from Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of America during the year 1799 to 1804. It's taken from chapter 2.19, and I entitle it Body Painting of the Orinoco Indians. This is recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Red paint being in some sort the only clothing of the Indians, two kinds may be distinguished among them according as they are more or less affluent. The common decoration of the Caribs, the Ottomacs, and the Jarurus is anoto. Properly, anoto. This word belongs to the Tamanac Indians. The Maypures call it mejepa. The Spanish missionaries say onotarse, to rub the skin with anoto. Called by the Spaniards achote, and by the planters of Cayenne, roku. It is the coloring matter extracted from the pulp of the Bixa orellana. The word Bixa, adopted by botanists, is derived from the ancient language of Haiti, the island of Saint Domingo. Roku, the term commonly used by the French, is derived from the Brazilian word urucu. The Indian women prepare the anato by throwing the seeds of the plant into a tub filled with water. They beat this water for an hour, and then leave it to deposit the coloring fecula, which is of an intense brick red. After having separated the water, they take out the fecula, dry it between their hands, knead it with the oil of turtles' eggs, and form it into round cakes of 3 or 4 ounces weight. When turtle oil is wanting, some tribes mix with the anato the fat of the crocodile. Another pigment, much more valuable, is extracted from a plant of the family of the bignoniae, which Monsieur Bonpland has made known by the name of Bignonia chica. It climbs up and clings to the tallest trees by the aid of tendrils. Its bilabiate flowers are an inch long, of a fine violet color, and disposed by 2s or 3s. The bipinnate leaves become reddish in drying. The fruit is a pod, filled with winged seeds, and is 2 feet long. This plant grows spontaneously and in great abundance near Maypures, and in going up the Orinoco, beyond the mouth of the Guaviare, from Santa Barbara to the lofty mountain of Duida, particularly near Esmeralda. We also found it on the banks of the Cassiquiare. The red pigment of chica is not obtained from the fruit, like the anoto, but from the leaves macerated in water. The coloring matter separates in the form of a light powder. It is collected, without being mixed with turtle oil, into little lumps 8 or 9 inches long, and from 2 to 3 high, rounded at the edges. These lumps, when heated, emit an agreeable smell of benzoin. When the chica is subjected to distillation, it yields no sensible traces of ammonia. It is not, like indigo, a substance combined with azote. It dissolves slightly in sulfuric and muriatic acids, and even in alkalis. Ground with oil, the chica furnishes a red color that has a tint of lake. Applied to wool, it might be confounded with madder red. There is no doubt but that the chica, unknown in Europe before our travels, may be employed usefully in the arts. The nations on the Orinoco, by whom this pigment is best prepared, are the Salivas, the Guipunavis, or Guepunavis, they call themselves Uipunavi, the Caveres, and the Piraroas. The processes of infusion and maceration are in general very common among all the nations on the Orinoco. Thus the Maypures carry on a trade of barter with the little loaves of puruma, which is a vegetable fecula, dried in the manner of indigo, and yielding a very permanent yellow color. The chemistry of the savage is reduced to the preparation of pigments, that of poisons, and the dulcification of the amylaceous roots, which the aroides and euphorbiaceous plants afford. Most of the missionaries of the upper and lower Orinoco permit the Indians of their missions to paint their skins. It is painful to add that some of them speculate on this barbarous practice of the natives. in their huts, pompously called conventos. In the missions, the priest's house bears the name of the convent. I have often seen stores of chica which they sold as high as 4 francs the cake. To form a just idea of the extravagance of the decoration of these naked Indians, I must observe that a man of large stature gains with difficulty enough by the labor of a fortnight to procure in exchange the chica necessary to paint himself red. Thus, as we say, in temperate climates, of a poor man, he has not enough to clothe himself, you hear the Indians of the Orinoco say, "That man is so poor that he has not enough to paint half his body." The little trade in chica is carried on chiefly with the tribes of the lower Orinoco, whose country does not produce the plant which furnishes this much valued substance. The Caribs and the Ottomacs paint only the head and the hair with chica, but the Salives possess this pigment in sufficient abundance to cover their whole bodies. When the missionaries send on their own account small cargoes of cacao, tobacco, and chaquichiqui, ropes made with the petioles of a palm tree with pinnate leaves, from the Rio Negro to Angostura, they always add some cakes of chica, as being articles of merchandise in great request. The custom of painting is not equally ancient among all the tribes of the Orinoco. It has increased since the time when the powerful nation of the Caribs made frequent incursions into those countries. The victors and the vanquished were alike naked, and to please the conqueror it was necessary to paint like him, and to assume his color. The influence of the Caribs has now ceased, and they remain circumscribed between the rivers Caroni, Cayuni, and Paraguamuzi, but the Caribbean fashion of painting the whole body is still preserved. The custom has survived the conquest. Does the use of the anato and chica derive its origin from the desire of pleasing and the taste for ornament, so common among the most savage nations, or must we suppose it to be founded on the observation that these coloring and oily matters with which the skin is plastered preserve it from the sting of the mosquitoes? I have often heard this question discussed in Europe, but in the missions of the Orinoco, and wherever within the tropics the air is filled with venomous insects, the inquiry would appear absurd. The Carib and the Salive, who are painted red, are not less cruelly tormented by the mosquitoes and the zancudos than the Indians whose bodies are plastered with no color. The sting of the insect causes no swelling in either, and scarcely ever produces those little pustules which occasion such smarting and itching to Europeans recently arrived. But the native and the white suffer equally from the sting, till the insect has withdrawn its sucker from the skin. After 1,000 useless essays, Monsieur Bonpland and myself tried the expedient of rubbing our hands and arms with the fat of the crocodile and the oil of turtle eggs, but we never felt the least relief, and were stung as before. I know that the Laplanders boast of oil and fat as the most useful preservatives, but the insects of Scandinavia are not of the same species as those of the Orinoco. The smoke of tobacco drives away our gnats, while it is employed in vain against the zancudos. If the application of fat and astringent substances preserve the inhabitants of these countries from the torment of insects, as Father Guimia alleges, why has not the custom of painting the skin become general on these shores? The pulp of the anato and even the chica are astringent and slightly purgative. Why do so many naked natives paint only the face, though living in the neighborhood of those who paint the whole body, the Caribs, the Salives, the Tamanacs, and the Maypures? We are struck with the observation that the Indians of the Orinoco, like the natives of North America, prefer the substances that yield a red color to every other. Is this predilection founded on the facility with which the savage procures ochreous earths, or the coloring fecula of anato and of chica? I doubt this much. Indigo grows wild in a great part of equinoctial America. This plant, like so many other leguminous plants, would have furnished the natives abundantly with pigments to color themselves blue like the ancient Britons. The half-clad nations of the temperate zone often paint their skin of the same color as that with which their clothes are dyed. Yet we see no American tribe painted with indigo. It appears to me probable, as I have already hinted above, that the preference given by the Americans to the red color is generally founded on the tendencies which nations feel to attribute the idea of beauty to whatever characterizes their national physiognomy. Men whose skin is naturally of a brownish red love a red color. If they be born with a forehead little raised and the head flat, they endeavor to depress the foreheads of their children. If they be distinguished from other nations by a thin beard, they try to eradicate the few hairs that nature has given them. They think themselves embellished in proportion as they heighten the characteristic marks of their race or of their national conformation. This is the end of Body Painting of the Orinoco Indians.
The Etymology of the Name Emu by James R. McClymont, recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Curran. The Etymology of the Name Emu by James R. McClymont. The name Emu has an interesting history. It occurs in the forms Emia and Emi in the Purchas' pilgrimage in 1613. In Banda and other islands, says Purchas, the bird called Emia or Emi is admirable. We should probably pronounce Emi in 2 syllables as Emi. This Emi or Emia was doubtless a cassowary, probably that of Siram. The idea that it was a native of the Banda group appears to have existed in some quarters at the beginning of the 17th century, but the idea was assuredly an erroneous one. So large a struthious bird at the cassowary requires more extensive feeding grounds and greater seclusion than this was to be found in any island of the Banda group, and as at the present day, so in the past, Ceram was the true home of the Malayan cassowary, which found and which finds in the extensive forests of that island the home adapted to its requirements. It is, however, equally certain that at an early date to the Ceram cassowary was imported into Amboina, and probably into Banda also, and we know of an early instance of its being introduced into Java, and from Java into Europe. When the first Dutch expedition to Java had reached that island, and when the vessels of which it was composed were lying at anchor off Sindaya, some Javans brought a cassowary on board Schellenger's ship as a gift, saying that the bird was a rare one, and that it would swallow fire. At least so they were understood to say, but that they really did say so is somewhat doubtful. However, the sailors put the matter to the test by administering to the bird a dose of Hollands. Perhaps the Hollands was ignited and administered in the form of liquid fire, but it was not expressively stated that this was the case. This cassowary was brought alive to Amsterdam in 1597, and was presented to the Estates of Holland at The Hague. A figure of it, under the name Emi, appears in the 4th and 5th German editions of the account of this voyage of the Dutch to Java by Hulsius, published at Frankfurt in 1606 and 1625. The figure is a fairly accurate representation of an immature cassowary. Whence comes, let us ask, the name Emi and the later form Emu? The New Historical English Dictionary suggests a derivation from a Portuguese word, Ema, signifying a crane, but no authority is quoted to prove that Ema signifies, or ever signified, crane. On the other hand, various Portuguese dictionaries which have been consulted render Ema by cassowar, or state that the name Ema is applicable to several birds, of which the crane is not one. Magalhaes de Gandavo, in his Historia da Provincia Sancta Cruz, published in 1576, uses the name Hema in writing of the Rhea or Nandu. It is worthy of note that the Arabic name of the cassowary is Naima, and that there were many Arab traders in the Malayan archipelago at the time when the Portuguese first navigated it. The Portuguese strangely distorted Malay and Arabic names, and it would not be surprising if they reproduced Nima as Unaima. Salvadori, referring to history, General Devoy the Eighth, page 112, states that the cassowary which was brought alive to Europe by the Dutch in 1597 belonged first to Count Solms van Gravenhage, then to the Elector Ernest van Keulen, and finally to the Emperor Rudolph II. Ornat della Papusia e delle Molucce, the third, page 481. End of the etymology of the name emu.
Forecasting the Weather from Camping for Boys by Henry William Gibson. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Camping for Boys by Henry William Gibson. Chapter 19. Forecasting the Weather. Sunshine is delicious, rain is refreshing, wind braces up, snow is exhilarating. There is really no such thing as bad weather, only different kinds of good weather. Ruskin. It is said that this weather table by Buzzacott is so near the truth as seldom or never to be found to fail. Forecasting the weather. If the new moon, first quarter, full moon, or last quarter, comes between 12 and 2 a.m. In summer, fair. In winter, frost, unless wind southwest. 2 and 4 a.m. In summer, cold and showers. In winter, snow and stormy. 4 and 6 a.m. In summer, rain. In winter, rain. 6 and 8 a.m. In summer, wind and rain. In winter, stormy. 8 and 10 a.m. In summer, changeable. In winter, cold rain if wind west, snow if east. 10 and 12 p.m. In summer, frequent showers. In winter, cold and high wind. 12 and 2 p.m. In summer, very rainy. In winter, snow or rain. 2 and 4 p.m. In summer, changeable. In winter, fair and mild. 4 and 6 p.m. In summer, fair. In winter, fair. 6 and 8 p.m. In summer, fair if wind northwest. In winter, fair and frosty if wind north or northeast. 8 and 10 p.m. In summer, rainy if south or southwest. In winter, rain or snow if south or southwest. 10 and 12 a.m. In summer, fair. In winter, fair and frosty. Clouds. Every cloud is a weather sign. Low clouds swiftly moving indicate coolness and rain. Soft clouds, moderate winds, fine weather. Hard-edged clouds, wind. Rolled or ragged clouds, strong wind. Mackerel sky, 12 hours dry. Rain. Look out for rain when the tree frog cries. Fish swim near the surface. Walls are unusually damp. Flies are troublesome and sting sharply. A slack rope tightens. Smoke beats downward. Sun is red in the morning. There is a pale yellow sunset. Rain with east wind is lengthy. A sudden shower is soon over. A slow rain lasts long. Rain before 7, clear before 11. Sun drawing water, sure sign of rain. A circle around the moon means storm. When the grass is dry at night, look for rain before the light. When the grass is dry at morning light, look for rain before the night. When the dew is on the grass, rain will never come to pass. Fog in the morning, bright sunny day. Swallow flying high means clearing weather. If the sun goes down cloudy Friday, sure of a clear Sunday. Busy spiders mean fine weather. The winds. East wind brings rain. West wind brings clear, bright, cool weather. North wind brings cold. South wind brings heat. Birds fly high when the barometer is high, and low when the barometer is low. Direction of wind. The way to find which way the wind is blowing, if there is only very slight breeze, is to throw up little bits of dry grass. or to hold up a handful of light dust and let it fall, or to suck your thumb and wet it all round and let the wind blow over it, and the cold side of it will then tell you which way the wind is blowing. Weather Bureau. The U.S. Department of Agriculture Weather Bureau publishes a classification of clouds in colors which may be had for the asking. If you are near one of the weather signal stations, daily bulletins will be sent to camp upon request, also the weather map. A set of flag signals run up each day will create interest. The flags are easily made or may be purchased. Keep a daily record of temperature. A boy in charge of the Weather Bureau will find it to be full of interest, as well as to offer an opportunity to render the camp a real service. He will make a weather vane, post a daily bulletin board, keep a record of temperature, measure velocity of wind and rainfall. If you have lost your bearings and it is a cloudy day, put the point of your knife blade on your thumbnail, and turn the blade around till the full shadow of the blade is on the nail. This will tell you where the sun is, and decide in which direction the camp is. Points of compass. Face the sun in the morning, spread out your arms straight from body. Before you is the east, behind you is the west, to your right hand is the south, to the left hand is the north. A homemade weather prophet. For a homemade barometer you need a clean, clear glass bottle. Take 1 drachm, transcriber's footnote 1. Drachm, drachma, drachm, U.S. customary system equal to 1/16 of an ounce, or 27.34 grains, 1.77 grams. Apothecary weight equal to 1/8 of an ounce, or 60 grains, 3.89 grams. End footnote. Each of camphor gum, saltpeter, and ammonia salts, and dissolve them in 13 drachms of pure alcohol. Shake till dissolved. Then pour in bottle and cork tightly. Hang the bottle of mixture against the wall facing north, and it will prove a perfect weather prophet. When the liquid is clear, it promises fair weather. When it is muddy or cloudy, it is a sign of rain. When little white flakes settle in the bottom, it means that the weather is growing colder, and the thicker the deposit, the colder it becomes. Fine, starry flakes foretell a storm, and large flakes are signs of snow. When the liquid seems full of little, thread-like forms that gradually rise to the top, it means wind and sudden storm. U.S. Department of Agriculture Weather Bureau explanation of flag signals. Illustration: flags. Number 1 alone indicates fair weather, stationary temperature. Number 2 alone indicates rain or snow, stationary temperature. Number 3 alone indicates local rain, stationary temperature. Number 1 with number 4 above it indicates fair weather, warmer. Number 1 with number 4 below it indicates fair weather, colder. Number 2 with number 4 above it indicates warmer weather, rain or snow. Number 2 with number 4 below it indicates colder weather, rain or snow. Number 3 with number 4 above it indicates warmer weather with local rains. Number 3 with number 4 below it indicates colder weather with local rains. Number 1 with number 5 above it indicates fair weather, cold wave. Number 2 with number 5 above it indicates wet weather, cold wave. Forecasts made at 10 a.m. and displayed between 12 and 1 p.m. forecast the weather for the following day until 8 p.m. Plant barometers. The dandelion is an excellent barometer, one of the commonest and most reliable. It is when the blooms have seeded and are in the fluffy, feathery condition that its weather prophet facilities come to the fore. In fine weather the ball extends to the full, but when rain approaches it shuts like an umbrella. If the weather is inclined to be showery, it keeps shut all the time, only opening when the danger from the wet is past. The ordinary clover and all its varieties, including the trefoil and the shamrock, are barometers. When rain is coming, the leaves shut together like the shells of an oyster and do not open again until fine weather is assured. For a day or two before rain comes, their stems swell to an appreciable extent and stiffen so that the leaves are borne more upright than usual. This stem swelling when rain is expected is a feature of many towering grasses. The fingers of which the leaves of the horse chestnut are made up keep flat and fan-like so long as fine weather is likely to continue. With the coming of rain, however, they droop as if to offer less resistance to the weather. The scarlet pimpernel, nicknamed the poor man's weather glass, or wind cope, opens its flowers only to fine weather. As soon as rain is in the air, it shuts up and remains closed until the shower or storm is over. End of Forecasting the Weather.
Entry December 31st, 1865, from A Journey to Brazil, by Louis Agassiz. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. Entry December 31st, 1865, from A Journey to Brazil, by Louis Agassiz. The palms, as a natural group, stand out among all other plants with remarkable distinctness and individuality. And yet, this common character, uniting them so closely as a natural order, does not prevent the most striking difference between various kinds of palms. As a whole, no family of trees is more similar. Generically and specifically, none is more varied, even though other families include a greater number of species. Their differences seem to me to be determined in a great measure by the peculiar arrangement of their leaves. Indeed, palms, with their colossal leaves, few in number, may be considered as ornamental diagrams of the primary laws according to which the leaves of all plants throughout the whole vegetable kingdom are arranged, laws now recognized by the most advanced botanists of the day, and designated by them as phyllotaxis. The simplest arrangement in these mathematics of the vegetable world is that of the grasses, in which the leaves are placed alternately on opposite sides of the stem, thus dividing the space around in equal halves. As the stem of the grasses elongates, these pairs of leaves are found scattered along its length, and it is only in ears or spikes of some genera that we find them growing so compactly on the axis as to form a close head. Of this law of growth the palm known as the bacaba of Pará, Oinocarpus distichius, is an admirable illustration, its leaves being disposed in pairs one above another at the summit of the stem, but in such immediate contact as to form a thick crown. On account of this disposition of the leaves, its appearance is totally different from that of any other palm with which I am acquainted. I do not know any palm in which the leaves are arranged in 3 directions only, as in the reeds and sedges of our marshes, unless it be the Jacitara desmoncus, whose winding slender stem, however, makes the observation uncertain. An arrangement in 5 different directions is common in all those palms which, when young, have only a cluster of 5 fully developed leaves above the ground, with a spade-like 6th leaf rising from the center. When full grown, they usually exhibit a crown of 10 or 15 leaves and more, divided into tiers of 5, one above the other, but so close together that the whole appears like a rounded head. Sometimes, however, the crown is more open, as in the Maximiliana regia, Inajá, for instance, in which the stem is not very high, and the leaves, always in cycles of 5, spread slightly, so as to form an open vase rising from a slender stem. The açaí, Euterpe edulis, has an 8-leaved arrangement, and has never more than a single cycle of leaves, though it may sometimes have 7 leaves when the first of the old cycle has dropped, before the 9th, with which the new cycle begins, has opened, or 9, if the first leaf of the new cycle, the 9th in number, has opened before the first of the old cycle has dropped. These leaves, of a delicate pale green, are cut into 1,000 leaflets which tremble in the lightest breeze and tell you that the air is stirring even when the heat seems breathless. A more elegant and attractive diagram of the phyllotaxis of 3/8 probably does not exist in nature. The common cocoa-nut tree has its leaves arranged according to the fraction of 5/13. But though the crown consists of several cycles of leaves, they do not form a close head, because the older ones become pendant, while the younger are more erect. The pupunha, or peach-palm, Guilielma, follows the phyllotaxis of 8/21, but in this instance all the leaves are evenly arched over, so that the whole forms a deep green vault, the more beautiful from the rich color of the foliage. When the heavy cluster of ripe, red fruit hangs under this dark vault, the tree is in its greatest beauty. As the leaves of this palm are not so closely set in the younger specimens as in the older ones, its aspect changes at different stages of growth, the leaves in the younger trees being distributed over a greater length of the trunk, while in the adult taller ones they are more compact. This arrangement is repeated in the Javari and Tucumã Astrocarium, but in these the closely set leaves stand erect, broom-like, at the head of the long stalk. In the Mucajá Acrocomia, the leaves are arranged according to the fraction 13/34. Thus, under the same fundamental principle of growth, an infinite variety is introduced among trees of one order by the slight differences in the distribution and constitution of the leaves themselves. In the Musaceae or Scitamineae, the bananas, another order of the same class of plants, a diversity equally remarkable is produced in the same way, namely, by slight modifications of this fundamental law. What can differ more in appearance than the common banana, Musa paradisiaca, with its large simple leaves, so loosely arranged around the stem, so graceful and easy in the movements, and the banana of Madagascar, Ravenala madagascariensis, commonly known as the traveller's tree, which, like the bacaba of Pará, has its leaves alternating regularly on opposite sides of the trunk, and so closely packed together as to form an immense flat fan on a colossal stem. Yet, in all these plants the arrangement of leaves obeys the same law, which is illustrated with equal distinctness by each one. This mathematical disposition of leaves is thus shown to be compatible with a great variety of essentially different structures, and though the law of phyllotaxis prevails in all plants, being limited neither to class, order, families, genera, nor species, but running in various combinations through the whole kingdom, I believe it can be studied to especial advantage in the group of palms, on account of the prominence of their few large leaves. The most abundant and characteristic palms of the Rio Negro are the Javari, Astrocarium javari, the Murumuru, Astrocarium murumuru, the Uauaçu, Atalea speciosa, the Inajá, Maximiliana regia, the Bacaba, Oinocarpus bacaba, the Paxiúba, Iriarteia exoriza, the Carana, Mauritia carana, the Caranaí, Mauritia horrida, the Ubim, Geonoma, and the Curuá, Atalea spectabilis. Of these, the two latter are the most useful. The remarkable Piaçaba, Leopoldinia piaçaba, occurs only far above the junction of the Rio Negro and Rio Branco. We obtained, however, a specimen that had been planted at Itatiaçu. the many small kinds of ubim, Geonoma, and marajá, Bactris, and even the jará, Leopoldinia, are so completely overshadowed by the larger trees that they are only noticed when clustered along the river banks. Buçus, Manicaria, açaís, Euterpe, mucajá, Acrocomia, grow also on the Rio Negro, but it remains to be ascertained whether they are specifically identical with those of the lower Amazons. So peculiar is the aspect of the different species of palms that from the deck of the steamer they can be singled out as easily as the live oaks or pecan-nut trees so readily distinguished on the lower course of the Mississippi, or the different kinds of oaks, birches, beeches, or walnut trees which attract observation when sailing along the shores of our northern lakes. It seems, however, impossible to discriminate between all the trees of this wonderful Amazonian forest, partly because they grow in such heterogeneous associations. In the temperate zone we have oak forests, pine forests, birch, beech, and maple woods, the same kinds of trees congregating together on one soil. Not so here. There is the most extraordinary diversity in the combination of plants, and it is a very rare thing to see the soil occupied for any extent by the same kind of tree. A large number of the trees forming these forests are still unknown to science, and yet the Indians, those practical botanists and zoologists, are well acquainted not only with their external appearance but also with their various properties. So intimate is their practical knowledge of the natural objects about them that I believe it would greatly contribute to the progress of science if a systematic record were made of all the information thus scattered through the land, an encyclopedia of the woods, as it were, taken down from the tribes which inhabited them. I think it would be no bad way of collecting, to go from settlement to settlement, sending the Indians out to gather all the plants they know, to dry and label them with the names applied to them in the locality, and writing out, under the heads of these names, all that may thus be ascertained of their medicinal and otherwise useful properties, as well as their botanical character. A critical examination of these collections would at once correct the information thus obtained, especially if the person entrusted with the care of gathering these materials had so much knowledge of botany as would enable him to complete the collections brought in by the Indians, adding to them such parts as might be wanted for a complete systematic description. The specimens ought not to be chosen, however, as they have hitherto been, solely with reference to those parts which are absolutely necessary to identify the species. The collections, to be complete, ought to include the wood, the bark, the roots, and the soft fruits in alcohol. The abundance and variety of timber in the Amazonian valley strikes us with amazement. We long to hear the sawmill busy in these forests, where there are several hundred kinds of woods, admirably suited for construction, as well as for the finest cabinet work, remarkable for the beauty of their grain, for their hardness, for the variety of their tints and their veining, and for their durability. And yet so ignorant are the inhabitants of the value of timber, that when they want a plank they cut down a tree, and chop it to the desired thickness with a hatchet. There are many other vegetable products, besides those already exported from the Amazons, which will one day be poured into the market from its fertile shores. The clearest and purest oils are made from some of the nuts and palm fruits, while many of the palms yield the most admirable fibrous material for cordage, singularly elastic and resistant. Besides its material products, and of these the greater part rot on the ground for want of hands to gather them, the climate and soil are favorable for the growth of sugar, coffee, cocoa, and cotton, and I may add that the spices of the East might be cultivated in the valley of the Amazons as well as in the Dutch possessions of Asia. End of entry December 31st, 1865, from A Journey to Brazil, by Louis Agassiz.
The July Grass by Richard Jefferies. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The July Grass by Richard Jefferies. A July fly went sideways over the long grass. His wings made a burr about him like a net, beating so fast they wrapped him round with a cloud. Every now and then, as he flew over the trees of grass, a taller one than common stopped him, and there he clung, and then the eye had time to see the scarlet spots, the loveliest colour, on his wings. The wind swung the bennet, and loosened his hold, and away he went again over the grasses, and not one jot did he care if they were Poa, or Festica, or Bromus, or Hordeum, or any other name. Names were nothing to him. All he had to do was to whirl his scarlet spots about in the brilliant sun, rest when he liked, and go on again. I wonder whether it is a joy to have bright scarlet spots, and to be clad in the purple and gold of life. Is the colour felt by the creature that wears it? The rose, restful of a dewy morn, before the sunbeams have topped the garden wall, must feel a joy in its own fragrance, and know the exquisite hue of its stained petals. The rose sleeps in its beauty. The fly whirls his scarlet-spotted wings about, and splashes himself with sunlight, like the children on the sands. He thinks not of the grass and sun. He does not heed them at all, and that is why he is so happy, any more than the barefoot children ask why the sea is there, or why it does not quite dry up when it ebbs. He is unconscious. He lives without thinking about living. And if the sunshine were 100 hours long, still it would not be long enough. No, never enough of sun and sliding shadows that come like a hand over the table to lovingly reach our shoulder. Never enough of the grass that smells sweet as a flower. Not if we could live years and years equal in number to the tides that have ebbed and flowed, counting backwards 4 years to every day and night. Backwards still, till we found out which came first, the night or the day. The scarlet-dotted fly knows nothing of the names of the grasses that grow here, where the sward nears the sea. And thinking of him, I have decided not to wilfully seek to learn any more of their names either. My big grass book I have left at home, and the dust is settling on the gold of the binding. I have picked a handful this morning of which I know nothing. I will sit here on the turf, and the scarlet-dotted flies shall pass over me, as if I too were but a grass. I will not think. I will be unconscious. I will live. Listen. That was the low sound of a summer wavelet striking the uncovered rock over there beneath in the green sea. All things that are beautiful are found by chance, like everything that is good. Here by me is a praying rug just wide enough to kneel on, of the richest gold inwoven with crimson. All the sultans of the East never had such beauty as that to kneel on. It is indeed too beautiful to kneel on, for the life in these golden flowers must not be broken down even for that purpose. They must not be defaced, not a stem bent. It is more reverent not to kneel on them. for this carpet prays itself. I will sit by it and let it pray for me. It is so common, the bird's foot lotus. It grows everywhere. Yet, if I purposely searched for days, I should not have found a plot like this, so rich, so golden, so glowing with sunshine. You might pass by it in one stride, yet it is worthy to be thought of for a week, and remembered for a year. Slender grasses branched round about with slenderer boughs, each tipped with pollen and rising in tiers, cone-shaped, too delicate to grow tall, cluster at the base of the mound. They dare not grow tall, or the wind would snap them. A great grass, stout and thick, rises 3 feet by the hedge, with a head another foot nearly, very green and strong and bold, lifting itself right up to you. You must say, "What a fine grass!" Grasses whose awns succeed each other alternately, grasses whose tops seem flattened, others drooping over the shorter blades beneath, some that you can only find by parting the heavier growth around them, hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands. The kingly poppies on the dry summit of the mound take no heed of these, the populace, their subjects so numerous they cannot be numbered. A barren race they are, the proud poppies, lords of the July field, taking no deep root, but raising up a brilliant blazon of scarlet heraldry out of nothing. They are useless, they are bitter, they are allied to sleep and poison and everlasting night, yet they are forgiven because they are not commonplace. Nothing, no abundance of them, can ever make the poppies commonplace. There is genius in them, the genius of colour, and they are saved. Even when they take the room of the corn, we must admire them. The mighty multitude of nations, the millions and millions of the grass, stretching away in intertangled ranks, through pasture and mead from shore to shore, have no kinship with these their lords. The ruler is always a foreigner. From England to China, the native-born is no king. The poppies are the Normans of the field. One of these on the mound is very beautiful, a width of petal, a clear silkiness of colour 3 shades higher than the rest. It is almost dark with scarlet. I wish I could do something more than gaze at all this scarlet and gold and crimson and green. Something more than see it, not exactly to drink it or inhale it, but in some way to make it part of me, that I might live it. The July grasses must be looked for in corners and out-of-the-way places, and not in the broad acres. The scythe has taken them there. By the wayside on the banks of the lane, near the gateway. Look, too, in uninteresting places, behind incomplete buildings on the mounds cast up from abandoned foundations, where speculation has been and gone. There weeds that would not have found resting place elsewhere grow unchecked, and uncommon species and unusually large growths appear. Like everything else that is looked for, they are found under unlikely conditions. At the back of ponds, just inside the enclosure of woods, angles of cornfields, old quarries, that is where to find grasses, or by the sea in the brackish marsh. Some of the finest of them grow by the mere roadside. You may look for others up the lanes in the deep ruts. Look, too, inside the hollow trees by the stream. In a morning you may easily garner together a great sheaf of this harvest. Cut the larger stems aslant, like the reeds imitated deep in old green glass. You must consider as you gather them the height and slenderness of the stems, the droop and degree of curve, the shape and colour of the panicle, the dusting of the pollen, the motion and sway in the wind. The sheaf you may take home with you, but the wind that was among it stays without. End of the July Grass.
The Little Wolf of the Air, for Coffee Break Collection No. 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. The Little Wolf of the Air by Charles G.D. Roberts. The pool lay shimmering and basking in the flood of the June sun. On three sides, east, west, and north, the willows and birches gathered close about it, their light leafage hanging motionless in the clear, still heat. On the south side it lay open toward the thick-grassed meadows, where bees and flies of innumerable species flickered lazily over the pale crimson clover blooms. From the clover blooms and the vetch blooms, the wheel-rayed daisies, and the tall umbels of the wild parsnip, strange perfumes kept distilling in the heat and pulsing in across the pool on breaths of air too soft to ruffle its surface. Above this unruffled surface the air was full of dancing life. Gnats hung in little whirling nebula. Mosquitoes, wasp-like flies, and whirring, shard-winged beetles passed and repassed each other in intricate lines of flight. And here and there, lucently flashing on long, transparent veined wings, darted the dragonflies in their gem-like mail. Their movements were so swift, powerful, and light that it was difficult, in spite of their size and radiant color, to detect the business that kept the dragonflies so incessantly and tirelessly in action. Sometimes 2 or 3 would hurtle out for a brief expedition over the blossoming meadow. Often one would alight for a moment on a leaf or twig in the sun, and lie there gleaming, its 2 pairs of wings flatly outspread in a way that showed every delicate interlacing of the nerves. Then it would rise again into the air with a bold, vehement spring, and whenever it began its flight, or whenever it abruptly changed the direction of its flight, its wings would make a dry, sharp, rustling sound. The business that so occupied these winged and flashing gems, these darting iridescences, was in truth the universal business of hunting. But there were few indeed among all the kindred of earth, air, and water whose hunting was so savage and so ravenous as that of these slender and spirit-like beings. With appetites insatiable, ferocity implacable, strength and courage prodigious for their stature, to call them the little wolves of the air is perhaps to wrong the ravening gray pack whose howlings strike terror down the corridors of the winter forest. Mosquitoes and gnats they hunted, every moment, devouring them in such countless numbers as to merit the gratitude of every creature that calls the mosquito its foe. But every summer fly, also, was acceptable prey to these indomitable hunters, every velvet-bodied moth, every painted butterfly, and even the envenomed wasp, whose weapon no insect can withstand, was not safe. If the dragonfly could catch her engrossed in some small slaughter of her own, and, pouncing upon her from above, grip the back of her armed abdomen in his great grinding jaws, her sting could do nothing but dart out vainly like a dark licking flame, and she would prove as good a meal as the most unresisting bluebottle or horsefly. Down to the pool, through the luxurious shadows of the birches, came a man, and stretched himself against a leaning trunk by the waterside. At his approach all the business of life and death and mating in his immediate neighborhood came to a halt, and most of the winged kindred, except the mosquitoes, drew away from him. The mosquitoes, to whom he had become so to speak, in a measure acclimatized, attacked him with less enthusiasm than they would have displayed in the case of a stranger, and failed to cause him serious annoyance. He fixed himself in a position that was thoroughly comfortable, and then lay quite still. The man's face was under the shadow of the birch tree, but his body lay out in the full sun, and the front of his soft white summer shirt made a patch of sharp light against the surrounding tones of brown and green. When it had for a time remained quite still, the patch of whiteness attracted attention, and various insects alighted upon it to investigate. Presently the man noticed a very large steel-blue dragonfly on rustling wings, balancing in the air a few feet in front of him. At this moment, from a branch overhead, a hungry shrike dashed down. The dragonfly saw the peril just in time, and, instead of fleeing desperately across the pool, to be almost inevitably overtaken by the strong-winged bird, it dashed forward and perched for refuge on a fold of the dazzling white shirt. The foiled shrike, with an angry and astonished twitter, flew off to a tree across the pool. For perhaps a minute the great fly stood with moveless, widespread wings, scintillating aerial hues, as if its body was compacted of a million microscopic prisms. The transparent tissue of its wings was filled with a finer and more elusive iridescence. The great, rounded, globose, overlapping jaws, half as big as the creature's whole head, kept opening and shutting, as if to polish their edges. The other half of its head was quite occupied by two bulging, brilliant spheres of eyes, which seemed to hold in their transparent yet curiously impenetrable depths a shifting light of emerald and violet. These inscrutable and enormous eyes, each one nearly as great in circumference as the creature's body, rolled themselves in a steady stare at the man's face, till he felt the skin of his cheeks creep at their sinister beauty. It seemed to him as if a spirit, hostile and evil, had threatened him from beneath those shining eyes, and he was amused to experience, for all his interest, a sense of half-relief when the four beautiful wings hurtled crisply and the creature darted away. It would seem, however, that the fold of white shirt had found favor in those mysteriously gleaming eyes, for, a minute or two later, the same fly returned to the same spot. The man recognized not only its unusual size and its splendor of color, but a broken notch on one of its wing films, the mark of the tip of a bird's beak. This time the dragonfly came not as a fugitive from fate, but as a triumphant dispenser of fate to others. It carried between its jaws the body of a small green grasshopper, which it had already partly eaten. Fixing the enigmatic radiance of its eyes upon the man's face, the dragonfly calmly continued its meal, using the second joints of its front pair of legs to help manipulate the rather awkward morsel. Its great round jaws crushed their prey resistlessly, while the inner mouth sucked up the juices so cleanly and instantaneously that the repast left no smallest stain upon the man's spotless shirt. When the feast was over, there remained nothing of the victim but a compact, perfectly rounded, glistening green ball, the size of a pea, made up of the well-chewed, shell-like parts of the grasshopper's body. It reminded the man of the round castings of fur or feathers which an owl ejects after its undiscriminating banquet. Having rolled the little green ball several times between its jaws, to make sure there was no particle of nourishment left therein, the dragonfly coolly dropped it into a crease in the shirt bosom and rustled away. It chanced that this particular and conspicuous individual of the little wolves of the air was a female. A half-hour later, when the man had almost grown tired of his watching, he again caught sight of the great fly. This time she alighted on a half-submerged log, one end of which lay on shore by the man's feet, while the other end was afloat in deep water, where it could rise and fall with every change in the level of the pool. Quivering and gleaming with all her subtle fires, the dragonfly stood motionless on the log for a few seconds. Then she backed down close to the water's edge, thrust her long, slender abdomen a good inch into the water and curled it under her as if she were trying to sting the hidden surface of the log. In reality, as the man at once understood, she was busy laying eggs. Eggs that should presently develop into those masked and terrible larvae of hers, the little wolves of the pool. She laid the eggs in a row under the log, where there was no danger of the water receding from them. She moved along the log daintily, step by step, and her wings fluttered over the task. The man had taken out his watch as soon as he saw what she was about, in order that he might time the egg-laying process. But he was not destined to discover what he wanted to know. The dragon-fly had been at her business for perhaps 2 minutes, when the man saw a large frog rise to the surface just below her. He liked all dragon-flies, and for this one in particular he had developed a personal interest. Suddenly and violently he jumped to his feet, hoping to chase her away from the approaching doom, but he was just too late. As he jumped, the big frog sprang, and a long, darting, cleft tongue clutched the busy fly, dragging her down. The frog disappeared with his prize, to come to the surface again at the edge of a lily pad a few feet off, and blink his goggle eyes in satisfaction. He had avenged, though about that he cared as little as he knew, the lives of 1,000 tadpoles. End of The Little Wolf of the Air by Charles G.D. Roberts.
Curious Facts in Magnetism from Scientific American, March 29, 1879. Recorded for the LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Viscelli. Curious Facts in Magnetism from Scientific American, March 29, 1879. The meeting of the New York Academy of Sciences, February 17th. The article in the March number of Harper's Magazine entitled Gary's Magnetic Motor was incidentally alluded to, and Professor C. A. Seeley made the following remarks. The article claims that Mr. Gary has made a discovery of a neutral line, or surface, at which the polarity of an induced magnet, while moving in the field of the inducing pole, is changed. The alleged discovery appears to be an exaggerated statement of some curious facts, which, although not new, are not commonly recognized. If a bar of iron be brought up, end on, near a magnetic pole, the bar becomes an induced magnet, but an induced magnet quite different from what our elementary treatises seem to predict. On the first scrutiny, it is a magnet without a neutral point, and only one kind of magnetism, that of the inducing pole. Moreover, the single pole is pretty evenly distributed over the whole surface, so that if iron filings be sprinkled on the bar, they will be attracted at all points and completely cover it. Now, if while the bar is covered by filings it be moved away from the inducing pole, the filings will gradually and progressively fall, beginning at the end nearest the inducing pole and continuing to some point near the middle of the bar. The filings at the remote end will generally be held permanently. When the bar is carried beyond the field of the inducing pole, it is simply a weak magnet of ordinary properties, that is, of two poles and a neutral point between them. A plausible and simple explanation of this case is that the inducing pole holds or binds the induced magnetism of opposite name, so that it has no external influence. The two magnetisms are related to each other, as are the positive and negative electricities of the Leyden jar. Let the inducing pole be north. The south of the bar will be attracted by it and bound, while the north of the bar becomes abnormally free and active. On moving the bar from the pole, the bound magnetism is released, and a part becomes residual magnetism. Now, when the residual balances the free magnetism, which is of opposite name, we are on Gary's neutral line. In a restricted sense, there is a change of polarity over the half of the bar contiguous to the inducing pole. On the other half there is no change of pole in any sense. Experiment with a shingle nail in place of the filings a la Gary. Bring the nail to the induced bound pole, and it may be held, except at the neutral line. Now, if one will read the magazine article with such ideas as these, he will feel pretty sure that the writer of it has used words recklessly, that Gary has not made an original discovery, and that the neutral line, whatever it be, has only an imagined relation to the principle of the motor. The Gary motor, as a perpetual motion scheme, of course, is not worthy of serious notice from a society devoted to science. It has no noteworthy novelty of construction or conception. Mr. Gary is afflicted with a very old illusion of the cut-off or shield of magnetism, which is to cost less than what comes from it. His cut-off is the sheet of iron, which we know simply acts as an armature. End of Curious Facts in Magnetism from Scientific American. Recording by Tom Fischelli, Millburn, New Jersey.
Modification of Our Climate from Scientific American Supplement number 841, February 13th, 1892, by Joseph Wallace. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Wolff. Modification of Our Climate by Joseph Wallace. Every now and then some weather sage predicts extremely cold winters, and another ventures to say that the sun is gradually losing heat, and in time Arctic cold will prevail over the globe. Whatever may have been the changes during the vast cycles of time prior to the advent of man, or whatever may be the changes in the time to come, one thing is quite certain, that our climate has been much modified within the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. There have been 15 climatic changes since the beginning of the glacial age, each change lasting 10,500 years, and each change reversing the season in the two hemispheres, the pole which had enjoyed continuous summer being doomed to undergo perpetual winter for 10,500 years, and then passing to its former state for an equal term. The physical changes upon the earth's surface during the past 80,000 years modified the changes of climate even in the Arctic regions, so that the intense cold of the former epochs was much modified during the latter epochs. Reckoning these climatic changes in their order, we had entered the epoch of a more genial temperature about 1,500 years ago, and if no disturbing change takes place during the present epoch, we may reasonably expect a gradual modification of our winters for 9,000 years to come. The changes to intense cold from perpetual summer during the greater part of the glacial period are supposed to have been caused by the high temperature of the North Pole as compared to that of the South Pole, owing to the distribution of land around the two, the South having almost none. Dr. Kroll thinks it was caused by the varying inclination of the earth's axis, which produced the relative position of the two poles towards the sun to be periodically reversed at distant periods. Dr. James Geikie agrees with Kroll on the reverse of seasons every 10,500 years during certain periods of high ellipticity of the earth's orbit. But it may be asked, how could the fauna and flora propagate themselves under such conditions? The flora itself, at the Quaternary age, was of extreme vigor. We know this from the little which is left us, but more especially from the presence of a large number of herbivorous animals, stags, horses, elephants, rhinoceros, etc., which animated the plains and valleys of Europe and America at the same time. Evidently they could not have lived and propagated themselves without abundant vegetation for nourishment and development. That which has deceived the adherents of the glacial theory, as understood in its absolute sense, is they have generally placed a too high estimate on its extent and intensity. It needs but a little effort of the reasoning powers to come to the conclusion that the earth had cooled to the degree that all animal and vegetable life could exist upon it, and that a portion of the earth's surface permanently covered with snow and ice was absolutely indispensable to the existence, perpetuity, and well-being of animal and vegetable life. Again, they have attributed to the glaciers the rocks, gravels, and other material which they have found spread here and there long distances from the mountains. The transportation of the so-called erratic rocks has appeared inexplicable in any other way, and the piles of rock and gravel have been considered so many moraines, that is, deposits of diverse material transported by the glaciers. They do not regard the probability of other agents taking the place of glaciers, and undervalue the moving power of water. Water in liquid state has often produced analogous effects, and it has often been the error of the glacialists to confound the one with the other. The erratic rocks and the moraines are undoubtedly the ordinary indications of the ancient gravels, but taken isolatedly they are not sufficient proof. In order to convince, they should be accompanied with a third indication, which is the presence of striated rocks which we find in the neighborhood of our actual glaciers. When all these signs are together, then there is hardly a possibility of error, but one alone is not sufficient, because it can be the effect of another cause. No doubt the temperature was really lower at the Quaternary age, and at the epoch generally assigned to man's advent in European countries, but the difference was not so great as some say. A lowering of 4 degrees is sufficient to explain the ancient extension of the glaciers. We can look on this figure as the maxim, for it is proved today that humanity played the main role in the glacial phenomena. The beds of rivers and the alluvia are there to tell that all the water was not in a solid state at that time, that the glaciers were much more extended than in our days, and that the courses of the rivers were infinitely more abundant. When this is understood, we can reasonably reduce the extension of the ancient glaciers, the lowering of the temperature at the Quaternary age, and account for the uninterrupted life of the fauna and flora. However, we must not fall into the opposite excess and assert, as some have done, that the glacial period is comparatively recent, the traces of which are too plain and fresh in some localities to assign to it an age prior to man, and that the temperature has rather lowered itself since this epoch. The ancient extension of the glaciers has been followed by a corresponding growth and extension of animal life, thus proving that the permanence of glaciers is a wise provision and absolutely essential to man and the high orders of animals and vegetation. The ancient extension does not prove alone that it was much colder than in historic times, for the animals themselves are proof of this. At that time the plains of Europe, and of France in particular, were animated by herds of reindeer, gluttons, camels, and marmots, which one does not find today except in the higher latitudes or more considerable heights. The mammoth and rhinoceros are no exception to this, for naturalists know they were organized to live in cold countries. Space will not permit us to pursue this point further, or speculate on the probable climate conditions of the Ice Age, but we can carry ourselves back a few thousand years and describe the climate of Europe and neighboring countries of Africa and Asia. Herodotus describes the climate of Scythia in terms which would indicate in our day the countries of Lapland and Greenland. He shows us the country completely frozen during 8 months of the year, the Black Sea frozen up so that it bore the heaviest loads, the region of the Danube buried under snow for 8 months, and watered in summer by the abundant rains which gave to the river its violent course. The historian adds that the ass cannot live in Scythia on account of the extreme cold which reigns there. The following century Aristotle makes the same remarks concerning Gaul. His contemporary Theophrastes tells us that the olive tree did not succeed in Greece more than 500 furlongs from the sea. We can assure ourselves that both the ass and the olive thrive in these countries at the present day. 3 centuries later, Caesar speaks frequently and emphatically of the rigor of winters and early setting in of cold in France, the abundance of snow and rain, and the number of lakes and marshes which became every moment serious obstacles to the army. He says he's careful not to undertake any expedition except in summer. Cicero, Varro, Posidonius, and Strabo insist equally on the rigor of the climate of Gaul, which allows neither the culture of the vine nor the olive. Diodorus of Sicily confirms this information. The cold of the winters in Gaul is such that almost all the rivers freeze up and form natural bridges, over which numerous armies pass quite safely with teams and baggages. In order to hinder the passengers to slip out upon the ice and to render the marching more secure, they spread straw thereon. Virgil and Ovid insist on the severity of cold in the regions of the Danube. The first describes the inhabitants of these miserable countries withdrawing themselves into caves dressed with the skins of wild beasts. Ovid, who had passed several years of his life in that region, is more precise in his description. He says the wine has changed itself here, Black Sea, into a solid frozen mass. One gives it to drink by pieces. Fearing of being accused of poetic exaggeration, he appeals to the testimony of 2 ancient governors of Moesia, who could establish the facts like himself. The author who would give such accounts of the Black Sea in our days would risk his reputation for veracity. Italy, too, experienced its part of the cold in early days. Virgil tells us of the snows being heaped up, rivers which carried ice along, the sad winter which split the stone and bound up the course of large streams, and all this in the warmest part of Italy, at the base of the walls of Taranto. Horatius affirms that the Soracte, a neighbouring mountain of Rome, was whitened with thick snow, rivers frozen, and the country covered with snow. Today the snow stays very little upon the Soracte and never in the country around Rome. During the 4 or 5 centuries which followed, writers speak of the severity of climate in northern Italy, the lagoons on the Adriatic being frozen over. Algiers was much colder then than now. The Danube, Rhine, and other rivers in Europe, the Nile in Africa, the Amazon in South America, the Mississippi and Missouri in North America, had quite different volumes 2,000 years ago than their present actual ones, and they especially rolled much greater masses of water. There is everything to show a modification of climate in our own days. If this goes on in the future as in the past, there will be a marked difference in the temperature 200 or 300 years from now. Even a degree in 1,000 years would effect a great change in the course of time. The lowering of 4 degrees established the ancient extension of glaciers, though it did not interrupt animal or vegetable life. 54 of the 57 species of mollusca have outlived the glacial age, and all our savage animals, even a certain number which have disappeared, date equally from the Quaternary, and were contemporary with the great extension of the glaciers. Popular Science News. End of Modification of Our Climate.
The Onyx Caves, Part 1, from Cave Regions of the Ozarks and Black Hills, by Luella Agnes Owen. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Onyx Caves, Part 1, from Cave Regions of the Ozark and Black Hills, by Luella Agnes Owen. Northwest of Hot Springs, there is a group of 3 onyx caves, the distance to them being estimated at from 7 to 10 miles, if the party does not get lost, which is the usual fate of those who dispense with the service of a driver familiar with the country. In going, the longer way over the hilltops claims a preference on account of distant views with a favorable light. When the Onyx Cave Ranch is reached, its scenery is found to be charming, with an ideal log house overlooking the canyon, and itself overlooked by the rising slope of the wooded hill. The entrance to the cave is in the opposite wall of the canyon, and is covered by a small cabin, at the door of which the view demands a pause for admiration. Then the party disappears down a narrow, rough, sloping passage of sufficient height for comfort to none but know the value of comparative degrees. It soon appeared, however, that personal comfort would travel only a short distance. The mud increased with every step, and in its midst was a small hole through which it was necessary to pass to the next lower level. This hole being so small, and its walls slanting, the only way to accomplish the first half of the descent was to sit down in the mud and slide, stopping halfway to examine a fine ledge of beautiful striped onyx, white and a brownish pink, the first outcrop in the cave, but in the next level it is seen in rich abundance and variety, the colors being red, black, and white, brown in several shades, and pure white. All are handsome and of commercial quality and hardness, and just above them is a ledge of fine blue marble. The next chamber is called the Bad Lands, on account of a certain resemblance to that desolate region. The way into it is through the Devil's Corkscrew, a most uninviting passage because it stands on end and is about 12 feet deep, with circular, perpendicular walls discouragingly free of prominent irregularities, but careful study reveals a few available crags and rough edges, by which the descent is made. Fortunately the party decreased in size just within the entrance. Climbing up into a hole in the wall of this room with no little difficulty, the aerial lake is the reward of a breathless upward struggle, and a satisfying one. The lake is very small, but under its clear surface can be seen numerous growing deposits of calcite, while the roof of onyx gleams with a mass of small white stalactites. Returning again to the main route and traveling to the end of a short passage, we beheld the entrance to Red Hall, a piece of rope ladder dangling halfway down a perpendicular wall, the other half having no help whatever. The way was clear so far as the length of the ladder, and with trust in the future soon learned in cave work that distance was at once passed, and sitting on the very narrow ledge to cogitate on the possibility of further progress, Mr. Sidey solved the problem by suggesting, rather doubtfully, that the easiest way would be to drop off and allow him to interrupt the fall. This method had twice proved the only means of advance in Wind Cave, and can be termed rapid transit. The walls of Red Hall are of stratified limestone variegated with patches of red rock, and clay of the same gay hue. It is the highest chamber in the cave, and probably the largest. A hole in the wall at the floor level, near the entrance to the passage beyond, gives a glimpse of the cave river flowing on a slightly lower level, not over 2 feet below the floor we stand on. The water is said to have a depth of 15 feet, and a rock thrown in gave back the sound of a splash into water not shallow. Entering the passage already referred to, its dimensions decreased to a crawl, and then to a squeeze, so that most of its length was taken in a very humble position, which permitted no regard to be paid to the ample mud or little pools of water that must be serenely dragged through, as if carrying them away were an agreeable privilege. Even a muddy passage ends in time, and at last we gained a standing point, and after a short climb were in Fairy's Palace, a marvel of dainty beauty, and worthy of the distasteful trip just taken. We stood in a narrow passage that divided the small chamber like the central aisle of a cathedral, above which the white roof formed a Gothic arch, from which depended countless little stalactites and draperies, while on either side, 6 feet above the passage, was a floor of onyx supporting exquisite columns, of which the highest were not more than 3 feet. Only a short distance from the Fairy's Palace is the most equally beautiful ethereal hall, and connecting the two I had the pleasure to discover a small arched passage more beautiful than either. Although much of the cave was still not visited, the long drive to town demanded a return to the surface, but several stops were made on the way to admire masses of onyx and groups of curious forms in deposits of that fine stone. One high, crooked chimney above the corkscrew is especially fine, and correspondingly difficult for a grown person weighted down with garments dripping mud and water. But Kimball Stone, our boy friend, scampered up like a squirrel. 2 of the onyx caves had not been seen at all, and Mr. Sidey expressed special regret on account of the latest discovery, as no woman had ever yet entered it. But the sun was low in the west, and the road had some dangerous points that must be passed before dark, so the reeking skirt was removed, and without waiting to dry by the great fire kindled for the purpose, we hurried off, promising to return if possible, and carrying treasures in specimens, besides an ancient lemon, which may not be called a fossil, since soft substances are said not to fossilize. But however that may be, this is a perfect lemon whose particles have been replaced with the lasting rock in the same way as the numerous cycad trunks in the same region have been preserved, to prove to us conclusively that formerly the region flourished under tropical conditions, and supported an abundant animal life of tropical nature and habits. Soon after leaving the ranch, we descended by a sort of goat trail road into a grandly beautiful cañon, along the bed of which the road continues until it flows out as the water did in ages gone. By this time it had become quite dark, and the chill of the northwest night formed a combination with saturated clothing that cannot be highly recommended as a pleasure. But the natural chivalry which prompted our young escort to insist on lending his own coat, and his evident disappointment that the sacrifice was not allowed, afforded a pleasure that will continue. End of The Onyx Caves Part 1. Read by Trisha G.
The Passenger Pigeon. From Roll Call of the Dead Species of American Birds, via Our Vanishing Wildlife, by William T. Hornaday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. The Passenger Pigeon, by William T. Hornaday. The Passenger Pigeon, Ectopistes migratoria, Linnaeus. We place this bird in the totally extinct class, not only because it is extinct in a wild state, but only one solitary individual, a 20-year-old female in the Cincinnati Zoological Gardens, now remains alive. One living specimen and a few skins, skeletons, and stuffed specimens are all that remain to show for the uncountable millions of pigeons that swarmed over the United States, only yesterday, as it were. There is no doubt about where those millions have gone. They went down and out by systematic, wholesale slaughter for the market and the pot, before the shotguns, clubs, and nets of the earliest American pot hunters. Wherever they nested, they were slaughtered. It is a long and shameful story, but the grisly skeleton of its Michigan chapter can be set forth in a few words. In 1869, from the town of Hartford, Michigan, 3 carloads of dead pigeons were shipped to market each day for 40 days, making a total of 11,880,000 birds. It is recorded that another Michigan town marketed 15,840,000 birds in 2 years. See Mr. W. B. Mershon's book, The Passenger Pigeon. Alexander Wilson, the pioneer American ornithologist, was the man who seriously endeavored to estimate by computations the total number of passenger pigeons in one flock that was seen by him. Here is what he has said in his American Ornithology. To form a rough estimate of the daily consumption of one of these immense flocks, let us first attempt to calculate the numbers of that above mentioned, as seen in passing between Frankfort and the Indiana Territory. If we suppose this column to have been 1 mile in breadth, and I believe it to have been much more, and that it moved at the rate of 1 mile in a minute, 4 hours, the time it continued passing would make its whole length 240 miles. Again, supposing that each square yard of this moving body comprehended 3 pigeons, the square yards in the whole space multiplied by 3 would give 2,230,272,000 pigeons, an almost inconceivable multitude, and yet probably far below the actual amount. Happening to go ashore one charming afternoon to purchase some milk at a house that stood near the river, and while talking with the people within doors, I was suddenly struck with astonishment at a loud rushing roar, succeeded by instant darkness, which, on the first moment, I took for a tornado about to overwhelm the house and everything around in destruction. The people, observing my surprise, coolly said, "It is only the pigeons." On running out, I beheld a flock 30 or 40 yards in width, sweeping along very low, between the house and the mountain or height that formed the second bank of the river. These continued passing for more than a quarter of an hour, and at length varied their bearing so as to pass over the mountains, behind which they disappeared before the rear came up. In the Atlantic States, though they never appear in such unparalleled multitudes, they are sometimes very numerous, and great havoc is then made amongst them with the gun, the clap-net, and various other implements of destruction. As soon as it is ascertained in a town that the pigeons are flying numerously in the neighborhood, the gunners rise en masse. The clap-nets are spread out on suitable situations, commonly on an open height in an old buckwheat field. 4 or 5 live pigeons, with their eyelids sewed up, are fastened on a movable stick. A small hut of branches is fitted up for the fowler at the distance of 40 or 50 yards. By the pulling of a string, the stick on which the pigeons rest is alternately elevated and depressed, which produces a fluttering of their wings, similar to that of birds alighting. This being perceived by the passing flocks, they descend with great rapidity, and finding corn, buckwheat, etc., strewed about, begin to feed, and are instantly, by the pulling of a cord, covered by the net. In this manner 10, 20, and even 30 dozen have been caught, at one sweep. Meantime the air is darkened with large bodies of them moving in various directions. The woods also swarm with them in search of acorns, and the thundering of musketry is perpetual on all sides from morning to night. Wagon loads of them are poured into market, where they sell from 50 to 25 and even 12 cents per dozen, and pigeons become the order of the day at dinner, breakfast, and supper, until the very name becomes sickening. The range of the passenger pigeon covered nearly the whole United States, from the Atlantic coast westward to the Rocky Mountains. A few bold pigeons crossed the Rocky Mountains into Oregon, Northern California, and Washington, but only as stragglers, few and far between. The wide range of this bird was worthy of a species that existed in millions, and it was persecuted literally all along the line. The greatest slaughter was in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. In 1848 Massachusetts gravely passed a law protecting the netters of wild pigeons from foreign interference. There was a fine of $10 for damaging nets or frightening pigeons away from them. This was on the theory that the pigeons were so abundant that they could not by any possibility ever become scarce, and that pigeon slaughter was a legitimate industry. In 1867 the state of New York found that the wild pigeon needed protection, and enacted a law to that effect. The year 1868 was the last year in which great numbers of passenger pigeons nested in that state. Eaton, in The Birds of New York, said that millions of birds occupied the timber along Bell's Run, near Ceres, Allegheny County, on the Pennsylvania line. In 1870 Massachusetts gave pigeons protection except during an open season, and in 1878 Pennsylvania elected to protect pigeons on their nesting grounds. The passenger pigeon millions were destroyed so quickly and so thoroughly en masse that the American people utterly failed to comprehend it, and for 30 years obstinately refused to believe that the species had been suddenly wiped off the map of North America. There was years of talk about the great flocks having taken refuge in South America, or in Mexico, and being still in existence. There were surmises about their having all gone out to sea, and perished on the briny deep. 1,000 times, at least, wild pigeons have been reported as having been seen. These rumors have covered nearly every northern state, the whole of the Southwest, and California. For years and years we have been patiently writing letters to explain over and over that the band-tailed pigeon of the Pacific coast and the red-billed pigeon of Arizona and the Southwest are neither of them the passenger pigeon, and never can be. There was a long period wherein we believed many of the pigeon reports that came from the States where the birds once were most numerous, but that period has absolutely passed. During the past 5 years, large cash rewards, aggregating about $5,000, have been offered for the discovery of one nesting pair of genuine passenger pigeons. Many persons have claimed this reward, of Professor C. F. Hodge of Clark University, Worcester, Massachusetts, and many claims have been investigated. The results have disclosed many mourning doves, but not one pigeon. Now we understand that the quest is closed, and hope has been abandoned. The passenger pigeon is a dead species. The last wild specimen, so we believe, that ever will reach the hands of man was taken near Detroit, Michigan, on September 14, 1908, and mounted by C. Campion. That is the one definite, positive record of the past 10 years. The fate of this species should be a lasting lesson to the world at large. Any wild bird or mammal species can be exterminated by commercial interests in 20 years' time or less. End of The Passenger Pigeon by William T. Hornaday.
Plants Protected by Insects by Anonymous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. Plants Protected by Insects, from Scientific American, Volume 40, Number 13, March 29, 1879. Mr. Francis Darwin, in a lecture on Means of Self-Defense Among Plants, delivered lately at the London Institution, said that one of the most curious forms of defense known is afforded by a recently discovered class of plants, which, being stingless themselves, are protected by stinging ants, which make their home in the plant and defend it against its enemies. Of these, the most remarkable is the bull's horn acacia, described by the late Mr. Belt in his book, The Naturalist in Nicaragua, a shrubby tree with gigantic curved thorns, from which its name is derived. These horns are hollow and tenanted by ants, which bore a hole in them, and the workers may be seen running about over the green leaves. If a branch is shaken, the ants swarm out of the thorns and attack the aggressor with their stings. Their chief service to the plant consists in defending it against leaf-cutting ants, which are the great enemy of all vegetation in that part of America. The latter form large underground nests, and their work of destruction consists in gathering leaves, which they strip to form heaps of material, which become covered over with a delicate white fungus on which the larvae of the ants are fed, so that literally they are a colony of mushroom growers. The special province of the little stinging ants, which live in the thorns of the acacia, is, therefore, to protect the leaves of the shrub from being used by the leaf-cutters to make mushroom beds. Certain varieties of the orange tree have leaves which are distasteful to the leaf-cutters, this property of the leaves thus forming a means of defense. Other plants are unaccountably spared by them. Grass, for example, which, if brought to the nest, is at once thrown out by some ant in authority. The bull's horn acacia, in return for the service rendered by the stinging ants, not only affords them shelter in its thorns, but provides them with nectar secreted by glands at the base of its leaves, and also grows for them small, yellow, pear-shaped bodies, about 1/12 of an inch in length, at the tip of some of its leaflets, which they use as food. These little yellow bodies are made up of cells containing protoplasm rich in oil and afford the insects an excellent food. When the leaf unfolds, the ants may be seen running from one leaflet to another to see if these little yellow bodies are ripe, and if they are ready to be gathered, they are broken up by the ants and carried away to the nest in the thorn. Several small birds, also, build their nests in the bull's horn acacia, thus escaping from a predatory ant which is capable of killing young birds. The trumpet tree, another plant of South and Central America, is also protected by a standing army of ants, and, like the above-mentioned acacia, grows for its protectors small food bodies containing oil, but instead of secreting nectar in its leaves, it harbors a small insect, coccus, whose sweet secretion is much relished by the ants. Dr. Beccari mentions an epiphytal plant growing on trees in Borneo, the seeds of which germinate, like those of the mistletoe, on the branches of the tree, and the seedling stem, crowned by the cotyledons, grows to about an inch in length, remaining in that condition until a certain species of ant bites a hole in the stem, which then produces a gall-like growth that ultimately constitutes the home of the ants. If the plant is not fortunate enough to be bitten by an ant, it dies. These ants, then, protect their plant home by rushing out fiercely on intruders, and thus are preserved the sessile white flowers which, in this plant, are developed on the tuber-like body. End of Plants Protected by Insects by Anonymous.
Chapter 18 of The Story of Eclipses by George F. Chambers. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Eclipses by George F. Chambers. Chapter 18. Strange Eclipse Customs. I had intended heading this chapter, Eclipse Customs Amongst Barbarous Nations, but in these days it is dangerous to talk of barbarians, or to speak one's mind on points of social etiquette, so I have thought it well to tone down the original title, otherwise I should have the partisans of the heathen Chinee holding me up to scorn as a reviler of the brethren. Did space permit, a very interesting record might be furnished of eclipse customs in foreign parts. An eclipse happened during Lord Macartney's embassy to China, which kept the emperor and his mandarins for a whole day devoutly praying the gods that the moon might not be eaten up by the great dragon which was hovering about her. The next day a pantomime was performed, exhibiting the battle of the dragon and the moon, and in which 200 or 300 priests, bearing lanterns at the end of long sticks, dancing and capering about, sometimes over the plain and then over chairs and tables, bore no mean part. Professor Russell, who is quoted elsewhere in this work with respect to Chinese eclipses, makes the following remarks in regard to what happens now in China when eclipses occur. "It will be interesting here to note that, even at present, by imperial command, special rites are performed during solar and lunar eclipses. A president from each of the 6 boards, with 2 inferior officials, dressed in their official clothes, proceed to the Tai Chang Su. When the eclipse begins, they change their robes for common garments made of plain black material, and, kneeling down, burn incense. The president then beats 1 stroke on a gong, and the ceremony is taken up by all the attendant officials." A writer in Chambers's journal, in an article entitled "The Hindu View of the Late Eclipse," gives an interesting and original account of divers Hindu superstitions and ceremonies which came under his notice in connection with the total eclipse of the sun of August 18, 1868. He remarks that, "European science has as yet produced but little effect upon the minds of the superstitious masses of India. Of the many millions who witnessed the eclipse of the 18th of August last, there were comparatively few who did not verily believe that it was caused by the dragon Rahu, in his endeavor to swallow up the Lord of Day. The pious Hindu, before the eclipse comes on, takes a torch and begins to search his house and carefully removes all cooked food and all water for drinking purposes. Such food and water, by the eclipse, incur grahana sesha, that is, uncleanness, and are rendered unfit for use. Some, with less scruples of conscience, declare that the food may be preserved by placing it in darba or kusa grass." And much more to the like effect is duly set out in the interesting article cited. During the total eclipse of the sun of August 7, 1869, the following incident is noted to have occurred at a station on the Chilkat River in Alaska, North America, frequented by Indians. "About the time the sun was half obscured, the chief Ko Klux and all the Indians had disappeared from around the observing tent. They left off fishing on the river banks, all employments were discontinued, and every soul disappeared, nor was a sound heard throughout the village of 53 houses. The natives had been warned of what would take place, but doubted the prediction. When it did occur, they looked upon me as the cause of the sun's being 'very sick and going to bed.' They were thoroughly alarmed and overwhelmed with an undefinable dread." A still more thrilling incident is thus recorded of the eclipse of July 29, 1878, by a witness at Fort Sill, Indian Territory, U.S. "On Monday last we were permitted to see the eclipse of the sun in a beautiful bright sky. Not a cloud was visible. We had made ample preparation, laying in a stock of smoked glass several days in advance. It was the grandest sight I ever beheld, but it frightened the Indians badly. Some of them threw themselves upon their knees and invoked the divine blessing; others flung themselves flat on the ground, face downward; others cried and yelled in frantic excitement and terror. Finally one old fellow stepped from the door of his lodge, pistol in hand, and fixing his eyes on the darkened sun, mumbled a few unintelligible words, and raising his arm took direct aim at the luminary, fired off his pistol, and after throwing his arms about his head in a series of extraordinary gesticulations, retreated to his own quarters. As it happened, that very instant was the conclusion of totality. The Indians beheld the glorious orb of day once more peep forth, and it was unanimously voted that the timely discharge of that pistol was the only thing that drove away the shadow and saved them from the public inconvenience that would have certainly resulted from the entire extinction of the sun." A certain Mr. F. Kerrigan, in a book published in 1844, made the following remarks on ancient Jewish ideas respecting eclipses: "The Israelites, like their benighted neighbors, esteemed an eclipse of either luminary as a supernatural and inauspicious omen, which filled them with the most gloomy and fearful apprehensions; as may fairly be deduced from the 8th chapter of Ezekiel, verse 15, Then he brought me to the door of the Lord's house, which was towards the north; and, behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz." Now Tammuz is the name under which Adonis is known in Palestine. He was the favorite of Venus, or Astarte, the principal goddess of the Philistines and Phoenicians. Being killed by a wild boar, the prevailing superstition of the age induced the uninformed multitude to believe that when the moon was eclipsed, it was in compliment to their beloved goddess Venus or Astarte, who, concealed behind the full moon, sat weeping under a dark veil for the loss of her beloved Tammuz or Adonis." The African travelers, R. and J. Lander, have given a graphic account of what took place on the occasion of an eclipse of the moon of September 2, 1830, as witnessed by themselves. "The earlier part of the evening had been mild, serene, and remarkably pleasant. The moon had arisen with uncommon lustre, and being at the full, her appearance was extremely delightful. It was the conclusion of the holidays, and many of the people were enjoying the delicious coolness of a serene night, and resting from the laborious exertions of the day; but when the moon became gradually obscured, fear overcame every one. As the eclipse increased they became more terrified. All ran in great distress to inform their sovereign of the circumstance, for there was not a single cloud to cause so deep a shadow, and they could not comprehend the nature or meaning of an eclipse. Groups of men were blowing on trumpets, which produced a harsh and discordant sound. Some were employed in beating old drums, others again were blowing on bullocks' horns. The diminished light, when the eclipse was complete, was just sufficient for us to distinguish the various groups of people, and contributed in no small degree to render the scene more imposing. If a European, a stranger to Africa, had been placed on a sudden in the midst of the terror-struck people, he would have imagined himself to be among a legion of demons, holding a revel over a fallen spirit." End of chapter 18 of The Story of Eclipses.
Wildflowers of the Farm, Chapter 3, Flowers on the Walls, by Arthur Owens Cook, recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Amy Benton. Wildflowers of the Farm, Chapter 3, Flowers on the Walls, by Arthur Owens Cook. Behind the narrow strip of ground, with flowers and shrubs on the other side of the drive, there was a low stone wall. A piece of the lawn on which the mulberry tree stands has been cut away, and a flight of steps leads down to a little gate into the fold-yard. This wall between the garden and the fold-yard is very old and rough, not like the smooth brick walls you see in towns. The stones are of different shapes and sizes. The mortar has fallen out of it in many places, and here and there are holes and crevices. Yet it is a very beautiful old wall, for many things grow on it, mosses and grasses, and other flowers too are there. On this May morning we will not only see but also smell one of the flowers which grow upon the wall. It is the beautiful, sweet-scented wallflower. It grows here and there along the top of the wall, and a few plants of it are even springing from the sides. Some of the plants are quite large, and their stems are tough. These have grown here for a long time. The wallflower is a perennial plant. Unless it is killed or torn up by the roots, it will live and grow for many years. Others are quite young and only a few inches high. These have grown from seeds dropped last autumn by the older plants. You very likely wonder how the wallflower or any other plant can grow upon the wall, for there's no earth to be seen, nothing but stones and crumbling mortar. But if we pull up one of the smaller plants, we shall find earth clinging to its roots. Dry, dusty earth has been blown upon the wall by wind, and has lodged in chinks and holes. Dust and soil, too, were mixed with the mortar when the wall was built, and dead leaves falling upon it and decaying have produced a little more, for decayed leaves make earth or soil. Wallflowers and other plants which grow on walls and rocks find very little soil sufficient for their needs. Most of the blossoms of the wallflowers upon this wall are of a dark golden yellow color, and are very sweet. Some of the blossoms are, however, a darker yellow than others, and here and there are petals which are quite brown. If we look at the garden behind us, we shall see that Mrs. Hammond has several beds of wallflower this year. It is a flower of which she is very fond. There are wallflowers of two different colors in her beds. One kind has a bright golden blossom, rather deeper in color than any of those upon the wall. The other has flowers that are rich dark brown. These plants are sturdier and more bushy than those upon the wall, and there are more flowers on each plant. The flowers are finer, too, and have a stronger scent. If Mrs. Hammond had wished, she could have sown seed to produce many different shades of brown and yellow wallflowers. She might also have had a purple wallflower, or even a wallflower of so pale a yellow as to be almost white. If you and I were clever gardeners, and had plenty of time and patience, we could get purple or nearly white wallflowers from these yellow-flowered plants upon the wall. It would take us many years, but we should succeed at last, and this is how we should set about it. Suppose that we wish to have a wallflower nearly white. We should look carefully along the wall in spring when the blossoms are out, until we find the very palest yellow blossom we could see. We should mark that plant, and when the flower was over and the seed was ripe, we should collect the seed. Among the plants grown from this seed, we should choose again the plant that has the palest flowers, and should save the seed from that. We might have to go on doing this for 20 years or more, but in time we should have a wallflower so pale as to be almost white. Quite white we should never get our wallflower, for no pure white flower can be obtained from a yellow one. However pale our wallflower might be, there would still always be just a tinge of yellow or cream color in it. If, on the other hand, we wanted a purple or very dark brown wallflower, we should save seed from those blossoms which were nearest to the color we wanted, dark brown, or with a tinge of purple in them. We should sow seed from the darkest blossoms again and again, and at last we should get what we wish to have. Besides choosing seed from the lightest or darkest blossoms, we should tend our plants very carefully and well, giving them plenty of good rich soil. This would make them grow bushy and with many flowers, as we see them in Mrs. Hammond's garden beds. Many of our garden flowers have been produced in this way, by selecting and improving wild flowers. Of course all flowers grow wild somewhere, some in England, but many more in foreign countries, where the air is warmer and the soil richer and better. The pansy is a little English wildflower with yellow, blue, and red petals. From this little flower gardeners have produced large and beautiful pansies of many different colors and shades of colors, white, yellow, blue, and brown. This has been done by careful selection, just as we spoke of doing with the wallflowers. But if the large, single-colored pansies, of which I have told you, or Mrs. Hammond's dark brown wallflowers were allowed to seed themselves, that is, were allowed to drop and sow their own seed year after year, do you know what would happen? They would gradually revert or turn back to their original form and color. The flowers would become mixed in color and less fine in size. At last they would be simple wildflowers again. Now it is June, and the blossoms of the wallflower have faded and fallen. The old wall is, however, growing gay with another plant, the red valerian. We must be careful to remember that it is the red valerian, for there are other valerians. There is the great valerian, which does not grow on walls or rocks, but in damp and shady places. Its flowers are pale pink. The blossoms of the red valerian on the wall are bright crimson, and they grow in rows on small stems which spring from a stout stalk, a foot or two in height. Each blossom of 5 petals forms a little tube or corolla. The base or foot of each little tube appears as a point on the under side of the flower stem. The red valerian, like the violet, is a spurred flower. The leaves are long and pointed. They grow in pairs on opposite sides of the stalk. Sometimes the edges of the leaves are quite smooth, and sometimes they are serrated or toothed, like the edge of a saw. If we pulled a plant of red valerian from the wall, we should find the roots very long and branching. They need to be so, for the plant often grows on rocks and other places where it is exposed to wind. If the roots had not a firm hold, the tall stems, laden with blossoms, might be blown down. The red valerian flowers all through the summer. Its clusters of crimson flowers are as great an ornament to the old wall as were the wallflowers in May. Now let us go down the steps into the fold-yard. There's a wall on either side of us as we descend. The wall which faces the north is nearly always in shadow, and there are ferns growing out of it between the stones. One of these is a beautiful hart's-tongue fern, with large and shining leaves. We said just now, however, that ferns have no flowers, so we will turn to something that grows on the wall opposite. This is the ivy-leaved toadflax. It grows on walls and rocks as the red valerian does, but it is a very different plant in appearance. The stems of the red valerian are tall and upright. Those of the toadflax are slender and drooping, and there is a large mass of it on the side of the wall. And we find that the root is at the highest point of the whole mass. The stems of the flowers and leaves hang down below the root. It is a trailing plant. There are, however, other roots clinging to the wall, here and there below the main root. The plant, like several others, is able to throw out fresh roots from the joints of its stems, and these give it a firmer hold. The flowers are small, and their color is a pale lilac blue, with a bright yellow spot in the center. These flowers, too, are spurred. The leaves are smooth and thick, what is called fleshy. If they are divided into 5 lobes or divisions, they are not unlike an ivy leaf in shape. When we turn a leaf or two over, we see the underside of some is dark purple. This little plant is usually said to prefer a damp situation and to blossom from May until October. This wall beside the steps is certainly rather damp, for the moisture from the garden above soaks down to it. In my own garden, however, the ivy-leaved toadflax grows on some very old dry walls, and I have found it in flower in the middle of December. Neither the toadflax nor the red valerian are really natives of England. They were brought to our country many hundreds of years ago. They have spread so much that they have now become wildflowers. In the same way, many others of our wildflowers were once unknown to England. Now that we have come down the steps into the fold-yard, we see that it lies a good deal below the house and garden. Built round the fold-yard are the stables for the cart-horses, the cow-houses, and the great barn. Behind the stables is the rick-yard. That, like the garden, is above the fold-yard. From it there are only 2 or 3 steps to the door of the loft, or tallet, above the stables. It is there we will go now. The wall of the tallet is of stone, and is very old. The roof is tiled. There is a little hole cut at the bottom of the door, and you will see one like it at the door of the granary. It is made so that old Tib and all the other cats can go in and catch mice. Growing between the stones of the wall, just by the tallet door, is the plant I want to show you now. It is the stone crop. Some of the stems grow upright, while others are trailing. At the top of each upright stem is a cluster of bright yellow flowers. Some of these are fully open, and we see that each blossom has 5 pointed petals. The trailing stems have no flowers at all, they're barren, but the leaves on the barren stems are much more numerous and closer together than on those of the upright flowering stems. These leaves are very curious. They are not flat, like the leaves of the red valerian, the toadflax, and most other flowers. They are very thick and fleshy, something like a short, round, pointed stick. They grow close beside the stalk, not in pairs, but alternately, first a leaf on one side of the stalk, then a leaf on the other. They are erect, too. That is, they point in the same direction as the stalk. On the barren stems the leaves grow so closely they quite cover the stalk. They have a hot, sharp taste, and the plant is sometimes called wall-pepper. The roots are very thin, and can spread easily through narrow chinks of the wall. We will see one more plant of the walls before we look for flowers elsewhere. Our next plant is not very common at Willow Farm. Still, I know where to look for it. Built against one side of the big barn as the fold-yard is a little lean-to shed. Often there are calves in it. Just now we are more interested in something that is on the roof. Standing close by the wall of the shed is a cattle crib, a kind of big square box or trough on legs, in which hay or chaff is put for the cattle. The shed is not very high, and by standing on the crib we can scramble up onto the roof. Here is the plant we want to see. It is the house leek, of which a clump is growing between the tiles. Almost flat on the tiles is a dense mass of large, green, fleshy leaves. These leaves are evergreen. They do not die and fall off in winter. From this cluster of leaves rise straight, thick stems, nearly a foot high. The stems are thickly covered with erect leaves, which grow smaller towards the top of the stem. At the top of the stem is a cluster of very handsome rosy red flowers. Each blossom is star-shaped when fully open, and generally has 12 petals. If we could see the roots, we should find them very thread-like, or fibrous, like those of other flowers we have been looking at today. I do not think I can very well show you the roots, however. We should have to pull up a plant, and that would not please Ben the cowman at all. There is a belief in the country places that it is bad luck to disturb the house leek, that someone in the house on which it grows is sure to die soon afterwards. Certainly the plant is not growing on a house here, only on the calves' cot. Still, if any misfortune should happen to the calves, we might be blamed by Ben. Besides, it would be a pity to disturb so handsome a plant, would it not? We have spent some time in looking at these flowers on the walls and roof, because we think them very wonderful. We see how little soil they can have in which to grow, and how in dry weather they can have very little moisture either. Yet the leaves of several of them are thick and fleshy, and the flowers of some are large and beautiful. What could be more handsome than the blossoms of the wallflower, the red valerian, and the house leek? End of Wildflowers of the Farm, Chapter 3, Flowers on the Wall, by Arthur Owens Cook.
Entry for February the 13th, 1859. From Winter, from the Journal of Henry David Thoreau. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Entry for February the 13th, 1859. From Winter, from the Journal of Henry David Thoreau. February 13th, 1859, p.m. On ice to Fairhaven Pond. The yellowish ice which froze yesterday and last night is thickly and evenly strewn with fibrous frost crystals very much like bits of asbestos, an inch or more long, sometimes arranged like a star or rosette, one for every inch or two. I think this is the vapor from the water which found its way up through the ice and froze in the night. It is sprinkled like some kind of grain, and is, in certain places, much more thickly strewn, as where a little snow shows itself above the ice. The old ice is covered with a dry, powdery snow about 1 inch deep, from which, as I walk toward the sun, this perfectly clear, bright afternoon at 3:30 o'clock, the colors of the rainbow are reflected from a myriad fine facets. It is as if the dust of diamonds and other precious stones were spread all around. The blue and red predominate. Though I distinguish these colors everywhere toward the sun, they are so much more abundantly reflected to me from two directions that I see two distinct rays or arms, so to call them, of this rainbow-like dust, stretching away from me and about 6 feet wide, the two arms including an angle of about 60 degrees. When I look from the sun, I see merely dazzling white points. I can easily see some of these dazzling grains, 15 or 20 rods distant on any side, though the facet which reflects the light cannot be more than 1/10 or 1/12 of an inch at most. Yet I might easily, and commonly do, overlook all this. Winter comes to make walking possible where there was no walking in summer. Not till winter can we take possession of the whole of our territory. I have 3 great highways raying out from one center which is near my door. I may walk down the main river or up either of its 2 branches. Could any avenues be contrived more convenient? With the river I am not compelled to walk in the tracks of horses. Never is there so much light in the air as in one of these bright winter afternoons, when all the earth is covered with new-fallen snow, and there is not a cloud in the sky. The sky is much the darkest side, like the bluish lining of an eggshell. With this white earth beneath, and that spotless, skimmed milk sky above him, man is but a black speck enclosed in a white eggshell. Sometimes in our prosaic moods life appears to us but a certain number more of days like those we have lived, to be cheered not by more friends and friendship, but probably fewer and less, as perchance we anticipate the end of this day before it is done, close the shutters, and with a cheerless resignation commence the barren evening whose fruitless end we clearly see. We despondently think that all of life which is left is only this experience, repeated a certain number of times, and so it would be if it were not for the faculty of imagination. The wonderful stillness of a winter day. The sources of sound are, as it were, frozen up. Scarcely a tinkling rill of it is to be heard. When we listen, we hear only that sound of the surf of our internal sea, rising and swelling in our ears as in two seashells. It is the Sabbath of the year, stillness audible, or at most we hear the ice belching and crackling as if struggling for utterance. A transient acquaintance with any phenomenon is not sufficient to make it completely the subject of your muse. You must be so conversant with it as to remember it, and be reminded of it long afterward, while it lies remotely fair and Elysian in the horizon, approachable only by the imagination. End of entry for February the 13th, 1859. From Winter, from the Journal of Henry David Thoreau.
The Wit of a Duck by John Burroughs. Recorded for LibriVox Coffee Break Collection, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The homing instinct in birds and animals is one of their most remarkable traits. Their strong local attachments and their skill in finding their way back when removed to a distance. It seems at times as if they possess some extra sense, the home sense, which operates unerringly. I saw this illustrated one spring in the case of a mallard drake. My son had 2 ducks, and to mate with them he procured a drake of a neighbor who lived 2 miles south of us. He brought the drake home in a bag. The bird had no opportunity to see the road along which it was carried, or to get the general direction, except at the time of starting, when the boy carried him a few rods openly. He was placed with the ducks in a spring run, under a tree in a secluded place on the river slope, about 100 yards from the highway. The 2 ducks treated him very contemptuously. It was easy to see that the drake was homesick from the first hour, and soon he left the presence of the scornful ducks. Then we shut the 3 in a barn together, and kept them there a day and a night. Still the friendship did not ripen. The ducks and the drake separated the moment we let them out. Left to himself, the drake at once turned his head homeward and started up the hill for the highway. Then we shut the trio together again for a couple of days, but with the same results as before. There seemed to be but one thought in the mind of the drake, and that was home. Several times we headed off and brought him back, till finally, on the 3rd or 4th day, I said to my son, "If that drake is really bound to go home, we shall have an opportunity to make a trial, and I will go with him to see that he has fair play." We withdrew, and the homesick mallard started up through the currant patch, then through the vineyard towards the highway, which he had never seen. When we reached the fence, he followed it south till he came to the open gate, where he took the road as confidently as if he knew for certain that it would lead him straight to his mate. How eagerly he paddled along, glancing right and left, and increasing his speed at every step. I kept about 50 yards behind him. Presently he met a dog. He paused and eyed the animal for a moment, and then turned to the right along a road which diverged just at that point, and which led to the railroad station. I followed, thinking the drake would soon lose his bearings, and get hopelessly confused in the tangle of roads that converged at the station. But he seemed to have an exact map of the country in his mind. He soon left the station road, went around a house, through a vineyard, till he struck a stone fence that crossed the road at right angles. This he followed eastward till it was joined by a barbed wire fence, under which he passed, and again entered the highway he had first taken. Then down the road he paddled, with renewed confidence, under the trees down a hill, through a grove, over a bridge, up the hill again towards home. Presently he found his clue cut in two by the railroad track. This was something he had never before seen. He paused, glanced up it, then down it, then at the highway across it, and quickly concluded this last was his course. On he went, faster and faster. He had now gone half the distance, and was getting tired. A little pool of water by the roadside caught his eye. Into it he plunged, bathed, drank, preened his plumage for a few moments, and then started homeward again. He knew his home was on the upper side of the highway, for he kept his eye bent in that direction, scanning the fields. Twice he stopped, stretched himself up, and scanned the landscape intently. Then on again. It seemed as if an invisible cord was attached to him, and he was being pulled down the road. Just opposite a farm lane, which led up to a group of farm buildings, and which did indeed look like his home lane, he paused and seemed to be debating with himself. Two women just then came along. They lifted and flirted their skirts, for it was raining, and this disturbed him again, and decided him to take to the farm lane. Up the lane he went, rather doubtingly, I thought. In a few moments it brought him to a barnyard, where a group of hens caught his eye. Evidently he was on good terms with these hens at home, for he made up to these eagerly, as if to tell them his troubles. But the hens knew no ducks, then withdrew suspiciously, then assumed a threatening attitude, till one old Dominic put up her feathers and charged upon him viciously. Again he tried to make up to them, quacking softly, and again he was repulsed. Then the cattle in the yard spied this stranger and came sniffing towards it, full of curiosity. The drake quickly concluded he had got into the wrong place, and turned his face southward again. Through the fence he went into a ploughed field. Presently another stone fence crossed his path. Along this he again turned towards the highway. In a few minutes he found himself in a corner, formed by the meeting of two stone fences. Then he turned appealingly to me, uttering the soft note of the mallard. To use his wings never seemed to cross his mind. Well, I am bound to confess that I helped the drake over the wall, but I sat him down in the road as impartially as I could. How well his pink feet knew the course! How they flew up the road! His green head and white throat fairly twinkled under the long avenue of oaks and chestnuts. At last we came in sight of the home lane, which led up to the farmhouse 100 or more yards from the road. I was curious to see if he would recognize the place. At the gate leading to the lane he paused. He had just gone up a lane that looked like that, and had been disappointed. What should he do now? Truth compels me to say that he overshot his mark. He kept on hesitating along the highway. It was now nearly night. I felt sure the duck would soon discover his mistake, but I had not time to watch the experiment further. I went around the drake and turned him back. As he neared the lane this time, he seemed suddenly to see some familiar landmark, and he rushed up it at the top of his speed. His joy and eagerness were almost pathetic. I followed close. Into the house-yard he rushed with uplifted wings, and fell down almost exhausted by the side of his mate. A half-hour later the two of them were nipping the grass together in the pasture, and he, I have no doubt, was eagerly telling her the story of his adventures. End of The Wit of a Duck. Recording by Alan Davis Drake on the New Jersey Shore.